20 experts walked this soil. 20 men and women with PhDs hanging on their office walls, with decades of combined experience, with soil testing kits that cost more than most cars. They arrived in polished trucks. They took core samples from 12 different locations. They sent those samples to 3 FIPRIS laboratories. They ran the mineral composition, the pH levels, the organic matter content, the microbial life counts. They tested for heavy metals, for salt accumulation, for nematode infestations. They stayed for 3 weeks. They held meetings in a rented trailer at the edge of the property. They argued. They debated. They ran computer models and climate projections. And when they were done, all 20 of them signed the same report. The land was dead, not struggling. Dead. The topsoil had eroded down to clay hardpan. The groundwater had been poisoned by 50 years of chemical runoff from the upstream factory. The pH was so acidic that worms wouldn't survive in it. And without worms, there was no soil structure. And without soil structure, nothing would ever grow again. The official recommendation was to grade it, seal it, and turn it into a parking lot. The estimated cost of remediation was $4.2 million. The market value of the land was $12,000 an acre. The math was brutal and simple. Walk away. Every single expert walked away. And then, on a rainy Tuesday in March, a 12-year-old girl signed the deed with a pen her grandfather had given her, and she bought all 40 acres. Her name was Maya. She was 4'11". She wore boots that had belonged to her older brother, 2 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper to keep them tight. She had exactly $14,000 in a shoebox under her bed. It was every penny her grandfather had hidden in a coffee can before he died. It was supposed to pay for her college. It was supposed to be her safety net. It was supposed to keep her from ending up like her mother, working double shifts at the diner, coming home with swollen feet and hands that smelled like grease no matter how hard she scrubbed them. Maya's mother had been a nurse once. She had gone to school for it. She had worked in the pediatric ward at the county hospital. But then the hospital closed. Then the bills started. Then the diagnosis came, the one that Maya only ever heard whispered between adults. The one that made her mother's friends cry in the kitchen when they thought Maya was asleep upstairs. The land was the last piece of her grandfather. It was the last thing he had talked about in the hospital, his bony hand gripping Maya's wrist so tight it left bruises, his voice a rasp that barely made it past his lips. He told her the soil remembered. He told her it was waiting. He told her not to let them take it. And then he was gone. 3 weeks later, the developer showed up, Richard Hale. He wore a suit that cost more than Maya's house. He wanted to build a distribution center. He offered Maya's mother $60,000. He said it was generous. He said it was more than the land was worth. He said it was a miracle anyone was offering anything for a poisoned wasteland. He gave them 30 days. Maya didn't tell her mother she was going to the auction. She woke up at 4 in the morning, put on her brother's boots, took the shoebox from under her bed, and rode her bicycle 7 miles to the county courthouse. She was the youngest person in the room by at least 20 years. The auctioneer looked at her, then at the clerk, then back at her. He asked if she was lost. She said no. She said she was there to bid on the old Henderson property. The room laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the laugh adults use when a child says something impossibly naive. The auctioneer started the bidding at $10,000. A man in the back, working for Hale, bid $11,000. Maya waited. The auctioneer called $12,000. Silence. He called it again. Maya raised her hand. $14,000. Every dollar she had in the world. The man from Hale looked at his phone, probably texting his boss, probably asking if he should go higher. The auctioneer called it once. Twice. The man shrugged. He wasn't authorized to spend more on dirt that couldn't grow grass. The gavel came down. Maya owned 40 acres of poisoned clay. She was 12 years old. She had no plan. She had no experience. She had a shoebox that was now empty, a grandfather's whisper, and a dream that 20 experts had already declared impossible. The first tragedy wasn't the land. The first tragedy was watching her mother's face when Maya came home with the deed. Her mother sat at the kitchen table for an hour without speaking. She didn't yell. She was too tired to yell. She just looked at the paper, then at Maya, then at the paper again. She said, "Baby, we needed that money." She said, "Baby, that land killed your grandfather." She said, "Baby, I don't know how we're going to eat next month." And then she got up and went to work, because that was the only thing she knew how to do. The second tragedy came 2 weeks later, when the doctor called. The treatment wasn't working. They needed to try something else, something experimental, something that insurance wouldn't cover, something that cost $8,000 a month. Maya's mother said no. She said they couldn't afford it. She said she'd had a good life. She said it was okay. Maya listened from the top of the stairs, her hands pressed over her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The third tragedy was the rain. It came down for 6 days straight, a deluge that the Weather Service called a once-in-50-year event. The clay hardpan that covered Maya's land didn't absorb water. It repelled it. The water had nowhere to go. It pooled. It rose. It turned the 40 acres into a shallow lake, and when the lake finally drained, it took what little topsoil remained with it. Maya stood at the fence line, her boots sinking into mud that smelled like rust and chemicals, and she watched her inheritance wash away down the creek. She was 12 years old. She was alone. And she was starting to understand why 20 experts had walked away, but she didn't walk away. The next morning, she was back. She bought $5 worth of seeds from the hardware store. Lettuce, radishes, something that grew fast, something that would tell her quickly if there was any hope at all. She cleared a patch the size of a bedroom. She broke up the clay with a shovel that was taller than she was. She planted the seeds. She watered them with a watering can she carried from the creek, half a gallon at a time, making 40 trips a day. She talked to them. She sang to them. She told them about her grandfather. She told them about her mother. She told them that if they would just grow, just a little, just enough to show her that life was possible here, she would never give up on them. For 11 days, nothing happened. On the 12th day, the sprouts pushed through. They were pale and thin and fragile, but they were green. Maya cried. She sat in the dirt and she cried, and she didn't care who saw her. The next morning, the heat came, a record-breaking heat wave that baked the clay into concrete. The sprouts wilted. By nightfall, they were dead. The first failure was complete. The land had taken her money, her hope, and now her seeds. She tried again. This time she researched. She went to the library because she didn't have internet at home. She read about compost. She read about mulch. She read about raised beds and vermicomposting and nitrogen fixation. She spent 3 weeks collecting cardboard from behind the grocery store, hauling it home on her bicycle, piece by piece, until she had enough to cover a patch 10 feet by 10 feet. She collected coffee grounds from the diner where her mother worked. She collected grass clippings from the neighbor's yard. She built her first compost pile. She turned it every 3 days. She watered it when it got dry. She protected it from the rain when it got too wet. After 6 weeks, she had something that looked like soil, dark, crumbly, alive with insects. She built a raised bed. She filled it with her compost. She planted tomatoes and peppers and beans. She built a frame and covered it with old bed sheets to protect it from the sun. She woke up every morning at 5 to water it before the heat came. She checked for pests. She checked for disease. She talked to the plants, and they grew. For 3 weeks they grew. They got taller. They flowered. Maya started to believe. She started to imagine a future where her mother didn't have to work double shifts, where the medical bills were paid, where the land was green and alive and her grandfather was smiling somewhere. And then the locusts came. Not a few, a swarm, a black cloud that descended from the east and stripped every leaf, every stem, every flower in 17 minutes. Maya ran into the field waving her arms, screaming, crying, throwing rocks at the sky. The locusts didn't notice. They ate everything. They left bare sticks. They left silence. The second failure was worse than the first, because this time she had allowed herself to hope. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the porch steps with her grandfather's pocket knife in her hand, opening and closing the blade, listening to the cicadas in the trees. She thought about selling. She thought about calling Richard Hale and telling him he could have it. She thought about going to her mother and admitting that she had been a child playing at being an adult, that the experts had been right, that the land was dead and she was a fool. But she didn't, because the next morning she found the journal. It was in the old barn, the one that was leaning so badly that the county had declared it unsafe. She had been avoiding it. But on that morning, something made her go inside. The floorboards were rotted. The roof had holes that let in shafts of light. In the corner, under a tarp that had been chewed to shreds by rats, she found a wooden crate. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, was her grandfather's journal. The leather cover was cracked. The pages were yellow and smelled like tobacco and dust. She opened it. The first page had a date from 40 years ago. The last page had a date from 3 weeks before he died. And in between, hundreds of pages of handwriting, sketches, recipes, observations. Maya sat in the dirt of the barn and she read. She read about cover crops that fixed nitrogen in soil that had none. She read about biochar made from invasive weeds. She read about fermented plant juice, a recipe that called for specific weeds that grew in the ditches around the property, mixed with molasses and left in a jar for 3 weeks. It sounded like witchcraft. It sounded like the kind of thing that 20 experts would laugh at. And at the very back of the journal, on a page marked with a dried leaf, her grandfather had written a single sentence. The soil isn't dead. It's sleeping. Wake it up. Maya didn't know if she believed it, but she had nothing left to lose. She started that same afternoon. She walked the ditches. She collected the weeds her grandfather had named. She found the molasses at the feed store, the last bottle on the shelf, dusty and forgotten. She found glass jars in the recycling center. She followed the recipe exactly 3 weeks. She had to wait 3 weeks. While she waited, she started on the land. She used the last of her strength and the last of her mother's goodwill to rent a small excavator for 1 day. She dug trenches. She filled them with logs and branches and leaves and the cardboard she had collected. Culture. She had read about it in one of the library books. Buried wood that held water like a sponge, that broke down slowly and fed the soil for 20 years. It was backbreaking work. Her hands blistered. Her blisters popped. Her muscles ached so badly she couldn't lift her arms to wash her hair. Her mother watched from the window, her face a mask of worry and something else, something that might have been pride or might have been fear. On the 20th day, the fermented juice was ready. It smelled sharp and sweet and alive. Maya diluted it with creek water and sprayed it over the buried wood beds. She didn't know what she was doing. She was 12 years old. She was making it up as she went, following a dead man's notes and a child's hope. She planted her third crop, winter squash, hardy, determined. The kind of plant that didn't ask for much but gave back everything. She covered the beds with straw. She prayed, though she wasn't sure who she was praying to. And then she waited. The first green shoot appeared on a morning when the fog was so thick she couldn't see the barn from the house. She almost missed it. She was walking the property line, checking for erosion when she saw it. a flash of green against the brown. Then another, then another. The squash was coming up. Not pale and fragile like the lettuce. Not tentative. Strong, thick stems, broad leaves. Maya dropped to her knees. She touched the leaves with her fingertips. They were warm from the sun. They were real. They were alive. She ran to the house. She dragged her mother outside. Her mother, who had worked a double shift and only had 4 hours of sleep, who was supposed to be at the diner in an hour, who hadn't smiled in months. She stood at the edge of the bed, and she looked at the green leaves pushing through the straw, and she cried, not the quiet tears of exhaustion, the heavy, shaking sobs of someone who had been holding on for too long. She knelt in the dirt next to her daughter. She put her arms around her. She said, "Your grandfather would be so proud." And in that moment, Maya understood that this wasn't about money. It wasn't about proving the experts wrong. It was about keeping a promise to a man who had believed in the dirt beneath his feet more than he had believed in anything else in the world. But one bed of squash does not make a farm. Maya knew that. The neighbors knew it too. They drove by slowly, their trucks kicking up dust, their faces pressed to the windows. They pointed. They laughed. They called it Maya's folly. They said the squash would die. They said the first frost would kill it. They said the chemicals in the groundwater would stunt it. They said she was a child playing farmer and her mother was irresponsible for letting her. Maya heard them. She saw them. She didn't stop. She expanded. She cleared another patch. She built another hugelkultur bed. She made another batch of fermented juice. She planted corn. She planted beans. She planted pumpkins. She worked from sunrise to sunset. She fell asleep in the field with dirt under her fingernails and a pencil behind her ear, sketching plans for the next bed, the next crop, the next season. Her mother started helping on her days off, at first just watering, then weeding, then planting, then planning. The diner gave her fewer shifts, and she didn't care. She was home. She was in the dirt. She was with her daughter, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was breathing again. The frost came early that year. The neighbors were right about that. Maya covered the beds with every blanket, every tarp, every old bedsheet she could find. She stayed up all night, stoking a fire at the edge of the field, carrying hot coals in a bucket to warm the air around the most vulnerable plants. She lost some. She saved most. The squash survived. The pumpkins swelled to the size of basketballs. The corn grew tall and heavy with ears that were plump and sweet. Maya harvested her first crop on a Saturday morning in October. She loaded her mother's old pickup truck with produce that had grown on land. 20 experts had declared dead. She drove to the farmer's market. She set up a table with a hand-painted sign that said, "Maya's Miracle Farm." She was nervous. Her hands shook as she arranged the squash. She had never sold anything before. The first customer was an old woman who bought a pumpkin for pie. She said it was the most beautiful pumpkin she had ever seen. The second customer was a chef from the city. He tasted the corn raw, right off the cob, and his eyes went wide. He bought everything she had. He asked if she could supply his restaurant weekly. Maya said yes before she thought about whether she could. She drove home with an empty truck and $300 in cash. She spread the bills on the kitchen table. Her mother stared at them. $300. From dirt, from weeds and wood and a recipe in a dead man's journal. It wasn't millions, it wasn't even thousands. But it was proof. It was the first crack in the wall of impossibility. Year 2 was about scale. Maya was 13 now. She had grown 2 inches. Her boots finally fit. She had saved every penny from the farmer's market. She bought a used rototiller. She bought a greenhouse kit from a catalog, a plastic and aluminum frame that she assembled herself in the barn and dragged out to the field piece by piece. She planted in the winter spinach, kale, carrots, things that grew in the cold. things that the restaurants in the city would pay premium prices for. She learned about crop rotation. She learned about companion planting. She learned which insects were pests and which were predators. She built insect hotels from bamboo and old pallets. She put up owl boxes to control the rodents. She planted wildflower strips at the edges of the property to attract pollinators. The land started to change. The clay, where she hadn't built beds, started to soften. Earthworms appeared. She found them after a rain, fat and pink, doing the work that machines couldn't do, turning dead dirt into living soil. The creek, which had run orange with rust for as long as anyone could remember, started to clear. The plants were filtering the water. The roots were holding the soil. The mycorrhizal fungi, invisible and ancient, were connecting the plants in a network underground, sharing nutrients, sharing life. The land was waking up, just like her grandfather said it would. But Richard Hale hadn't forgotten. He watched from the road. He watched the pickup truck leave every Saturday loaded with green. He watched the greenhouse go up. He watched the no trees passing signs appear on the fence line. He made another offer, $80,000. Double his first offer. Maya's mother was tempted. The medical bills were still there. The experimental treatment was still out of reach. $80,000 would change their lives. It would pay off the house. It would buy health insurance. It would give them a cushion. Maya looked at her mother. She looked at the land. She said no. She said the land was just getting started. She said they hadn't seen what it could do yet. She said her grandfather had waited 40 years for this, and she wasn't going to sell his dream for $80,000. Her mother looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded. She called Hale and told him to stop calling. The line went quiet. For 3 months, nothing happened. And then, on a Tuesday in July, Maya woke up to the smell of smoke. Someone had set fire to the barn. The old leaning barn with her grandfather's tools still inside. The fire department came. They saved the house. They saved most of the field. But the barn was gone, and in the ashes, they found a gas can with a label from a hardware store 30 miles away. The police investigated. Nothing was proven, but Maya knew. Everyone knew. The third failure wasn't natural. It was human. It was cruel. It was designed to break her. And for 3 days, she sat on the porch steps, looking at the blackened skeleton of the barn. And she thought about giving up. But on the 4th day, she was in the field. Because that was the only place she knew how to be. She rebuilt. She used the insurance money from the barn, a small policy her grandfather had kept current out of habit, to buy a used tractor. She cleared the burned area and turned it into her largest planting bed yet. She planted fruit trees, peach, apple, cherry, trees that wouldn't bear for 3 years, trees that were an act of faith in a future she couldn't see. She planted them in the ash. She said, "You tried to burn us down. Watch us grow from it." She was 14 now. She had a driver's permit. She drove the truck to the market herself. She had 3 restaurants buying from her. She had a waiting list. She had people driving from 2 counties away to buy her tomatoes, which she grew in the greenhouse through the winter, which were red and sweet and tasted like summer in January. She had a small crew, kids from school who wanted to learn, an old man from down the road who had farmed for 50 years and said he had never seen anything like what she was doing. He said the soil was darker than it had been in his grandfather's time. He said the water in the creek was clean enough to drink. He said she had done what the experts couldn't do. She had healed the land. Year 3 was the explosion. Maya turned 15. She incorporated Maya's Miracle Farm LLC. She hired an accountant. She bought a second greenhouse. She installed drip irrigation, running lines from the well that had tested clean for the first time in decades. She planted 40 different crops. She experimented with heirlooms. She grew purple carrots and white eggplants and tomatoes that were black when ripe. She sold to restaurants, to grocery stores, to a CSA program that had a waiting list of 200 families. She bought the adjacent 20 acres. She had saved enough to pay cash. The land that no one wanted was now something people were asking about. Soil scientists started coming back. Not the same 20, new ones, young ones who had heard about the girl who had healed 40 acres of dead land. They took samples. They scratched their heads. They found microbial diversity that shouldn't exist. They found earthworm populations that rivaled old-growth forest soil. They found that the pH had neutralized. They found that the heavy metals had been bound up by plants and fungi, locked away in the organic matter, rendered harmless. They published papers. They cited her methods. They called it the Henderson-Maya Protocol. A 12-year-old girl had created a protocol. She had done what 20 experts had said was impossible, and she had done it with a shovel, a journal, and a recipe that sounded like something from a fairy tale. By year 4, Maya was 16. She had employees, 12 of them, full-time, with health insurance. She had a fleet of trucks. She had a processing facility built on the ashes of the old barn, where they washed and packed and shipped produce to 3 states. She had a scholarship offer from every agricultural university in the country. She had speaking invitations. She had a TED Talk with 2 million views, but none of that mattered to her as much as the numbers she read every Monday morning. 47 tons of organic produce annually. 12,000 families fed through her CSA and her partnerships with food banks. The land, which she had bought for $14,000, was now valued at $4.8 million, but the number that made her cry, the number that she kept pinned above her desk, was $2.3 million. That was the revenue from the previous year. That was the number that had paid off her mother's medical bills. That was the number that had bought the experimental treatment that had put her mother's cancer into remission. That was the number that had turned a dying woman's tears into laughter, that had given her back her life, that had let her quit the diner forever and become the farm's operations manager, running the books with the same precision she had once used to track patient medications. Richard Hale came back one last time. He didn't come in a suit. He came in jeans and a polo shirt. He stood at the fence line, and he looked at the green. The peach trees were blooming. The greenhouses were glowing in the afternoon sun. The trucks were loading. The workers were laughing. He looked at Maya, who was 16 now, who stood 5'7" in her grandfather's old boots, who had dirt under her fingernails and a pencil behind her ear. He offered her $4 million. He said it was his final offer. He said he respected what she had done. He said he wanted to build something there, something that would honor the land. Maya looked at him. She looked at the field. She looked at her mother, who was walking toward them with a clipboard in her hand and a smile on her face, healthy and strong and alive. Maya said no, the land wasn't for sale. She said it never had been. She said some things were worth more than millions. She said her grandfather had known that. She said she knew it too. Hale nodded. He understood, finally, what the experts had missed. It was never about the soil. It was never about the pH or the minerals or the microbes. It was about the person standing in the dirt, refusing to walk away. Maya is 19 now. She runs a 200-acre regenerative agriculture institute. She teaches farmers from around the world how to heal dead soil. She has a waiting list of 3,000 people who want to learn her methods. She still wakes up at 5 in the morning. She still walks the property line with her grandfather's journal in her back pocket. She still talks to the plants, and every spring, when the first green shoots push through the straw, she kneels in the dirt and she touches them with her fingertips, and she whispers the same words her grandfather whispered to her. Thank you for waking up. The land that 20 experts abandoned is now a classroom, a laboratory, a cathedral of green. It feeds thousands. It employs dozens. It has inspired millions. And it all started because a 12-year-old girl decided that impossible was just a word that experts used when they were afraid to try. The dirt doesn't care about your degree. The dirt doesn't care about your funding or your computer models or your consensus. The dirt only cares if you show up, if you kneel, if you listen, if you love it enough to believe it can wake up. That is the only secret. That is the only formula. And it is available to anyone, anywhere, who is brave enough to plant the first seed.